Sairam, I offer my humble pranams at the divine lotus feet. It's a joy to be with you all tonight. Greg sent me an email and asked if I would say a few words to you and asked me what I would like to speak about. I thought about it a little bit and figured, well, what would do the devotees the most good? What would help them the most in their sadhana? So naturally, I started thinking about what is most useful to me. And I thought about a quotation that I pray on and meditate on every morning about surrender. And so I thought, well, surrender would be a good topic. Just about at that time, Greg gave me a call on the phone and he said, John, we need a topic for you for our brochure, something like surrender. So I said, yes, it is surrender. So that's how the topic came to be. Before I give you the quotation, let me say something about the word surrender. The Vedantic word surrender, saranaagati, isn't really the same as the English word surrender. Let me just say one thing about Vedanta, because I'll refer to that several times. Vedanta is the anta, the end of the Vedas. It usually refers to the wisdom of the Upanishads and the higher teachings of the Vedas. So in Vedanta, we get the highest teachings. So in Vedanta, the word saranaagati really doesn't mean surrender to someone else or to some other being. It's more a matter of surrendering to your higher self, of learning what is the truth of yourself. It's giving up ego, desire, body, mind, personality, and realizing what is the truth of oneself. When we speak of body and mind, we're all familiar with our material body, but Westerners tend to have a little bit of a different definition of mind than what we learn in Vedanta. To a Westerner, usually when we speak about mind, we mean consciousness, pretty much just consciousness. Whereas in Vedanta, there's three divisions that we need to discuss to put this in perspective. There's the lower mind, manas, which is pretty much synonymous with ego and desire. Swami said that the mind is like a handkerchief. If you pull out all of the threads of desire, the handkerchief will disappear. So desire and ego and lower mind are almost synonymous. They all work around the same thing. And the goal of spirituality is, in fact, getting beyond the lower mind and moving higher in consciousness. So the second phase of consciousness, Vedantically, is Buddhi, the same root word as Buddha. It's higher spiritual discrimination. It means discriminating between what is real and what isn't real, what is temporary and what is eternal. And then the third aspect we're going to talk about is Atma. Atma is the divinity within ourselves. One of the greatest sayings of Vedanta, of the Vedas, it's called a Mahavakya, a great saying, is Atman is Brahman. The truth of the individual is no different than the divine universal truth, in the sense that a drop of the ocean is the same taste as the whole ocean itself. So one of the great blessings of the spiritual path is that if we come to know ourselves, we can come to know the divine being. We can come to know divinity itself. I have a little illustration that I like to use on this subject, something that reminds me of when I was young, maybe 8 or 9 years old. In my mother's study room, she had a globe. It was a dark blue colored globe, and it didn't have pictures of continents on it. Instead, it had pictures of star constellations, and it was filled with lots of tiny little holes. It was, in fact, a little planetarium. It had a bulb in the middle and a cord coming out the side. And what you would do is you would turn on the switch in a darkened room, and the light would cast the stars on the walls and the ceiling and all about like a little planetarium. And it's a good illustration for Atman as Brahman. The divine within ourselves is no different than the divine universal. We think we're all like the little stars projected on the walls and on the ceiling. They're all different colors and shapes and forms depending on where the light has fallen, but they're all generated by the same light at the center of that globe. The only thing that separates us is shadow. If you were to turn off the light in the center of that globe, then all of the stars would go out at once. We're all of the same nature, we're all divine, and we're all the light of God. So if we know the Atma, the light of the star, then we know the light at the center, the bulb in the center of the planetarium. You can't determine where the light from the center bulb ends and the light of the star begins. There's really no difference. It's all one. So our job is to realize that divinity within ourselves. So we have body, we have mind made up of lower mind, Buddhi, and Atma. So now I can share the quotation with you. And I don't even recall exactly where the quotation came from. I must have read it maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And I looked for it for a while. And then it finally occurred to me that it really doesn't matter where I read it, because I know it to be the truth from my own experience. And that's what I'm going to explain to you this evening. The quotation was from Swami, of course, and it goes like this. He said, "When you surrender fully to me, I will bear the burden of your welfare, and I will transport you across the sea of samsara, the sea of worldly concern." I'll repeat that. When you surrender fully to me, I will bear the burden of your welfare, and I will transport you across the sea of samsara, the sea of worldly concerns. Well, the first of these three parts is surrendering fully. How do we know when we surrender fully? It's kind of a difficult thing, in part because we're talking about surrendering to our higher self. We're not really giving up anything, and in fact, we're gaining everything. What we lose is nothing. It's the shadow between the stars. What we gain is the divine. And so really, that's what we have to follow. So when we say we surrender to the Lord, there's one little secret that helps. I say, when I surrender, Lord, I offer you ego and desire, body, mind, personality, worries and fears, hopes and desires. Well, one of the things you might worry about is whether you've truly surrendered or not. So the secret is, if you worry about whether or not you've really surrendered, you don't have to. That's something you've already given to God. You've already given to God the worry about whether you are truly surrendered or not. As far as giving God hopes and desires, you should be open to the fact that God can change your hopes and desires. He knows what's better for you than you know yourself. So that's, how do we know we're fully surrendered? Well, all you have to do is make the conscious decision. It's true enough that God is in control of everything. As Greg said, every leaf that falls. But in order for this to be effective, you need to make the conscious decision that you surrender these faculties to the divine. Again, it's yourself which is the divine. You only need to overcome the lower mind, body consciousness, which is really a passing thing. We probably have a number of young people in the audience, so let me give you an example. Say you're playing a video game and you're playing Civilization 6, and your job in the game is to create a giant civilization and you pick the form of one of the heroes as who you're going to play. Maybe you're Gilgamesh and you have a great physique and you have certain powers and various facets to your body, your mind, the personality. You have hopes and desires of conquering your foes. You worry and fear that perhaps someone will conquer you. But on the other hand, it seems so involved, and yet ultimately you know that you're just the player. This body, mind, personality, the hopes and fears, worries and desires are just passing. If you play video games and you play on a high degree of difficulty, which many people do because that makes it a challenge, then you play many games and you enjoy the game and you don't get so attached to the particular hero in the particular game because you know it's a very difficult thing to do. So what we need to do is realize when we're surrendering that we're not the body, mind, personality. We're not the hero of the game. We're the player. We're the inner witness. We're the inner divinity. So the second part of the quotation, Swami says, I will bear the burden of your welfare. I will bear the burden of your welfare. We're going to come back to that third. Next, we're going to go to the third line. Swami said that when I bear the burden of your welfare, I will transport you across the sea of worldly concern. Well, the only way to truly transport across the sea of worldly concern is to realize that inner divinity. You must go through the process of surrender, learn to discriminate through Buddhi, and learn how to become the Atmic consciousness, going from the star to the bulb in the center of the planetarium. Well, that's a very difficult thing to do. Swami has set the difficulty level on this game very high. And so it's not an easy thing to do. And so if you can learn from others in any place, you should do so. So we're going to start with that. And to do so, I have to tell you something about my own experience. I came into this lifetime with quite a benefit. My parents were both spiritual aspirants. My mother was studying yoga at an early age. My father was studying spirituality. And in the 1950s, about 1955, they packed up 3 children under the age of 7 and moved to India for 2 years. Well, that's not something people in America did in 1955. Moved 3 kids to India for 2 years. My father was studying with monks from the Ramakrishna mission up near Kalimpong, Darjeeling area, and my mother was learning Hatha yoga. When she came back, when my parents came back, my father published a book, Journeys on the Razor-Edged Path, and my mother started teaching Hatha yoga in the late 1950s, which was pretty much unheard of at that time in the US. Many people know her because there was a book written about her that depicted her as something of a teacher. The book was called Yoga, Youth, and Reincarnation, and her name was Marcia Moore. So we had a lot of people interested in spiritual things around our house at all times. As I grew up, I was exposed to a lot of these concepts, having lived in India and having parents interested in such things. But I never really found anything that particularly caught my attention for quite some time. I worked when I was in my high school years during the summer in a metaphysical bookstore my mother had on the coast of Maine, in York Harbor, Maine. So I had access to all of the books you would find in a metaphysical bookstore, all the Zen Buddhism, Theosophy, Alice Bailey, you name it, religions, everything. So I did a lot of reading. I did astrological charts for people, and I thought I had seen most everything. My favorites were the Indian saints, Ramana Maharshi and Ramakrishna, but I couldn't see how to progress forward myself. So, being at a loss, ultimately God's grace had to pick up the slack, I guess. When I was in college, when I was 18 years old, I was a freshman in college in Southern California, Claremont at Pomona College. I was in my dormitory room one day, Harwood Court, and I was thinking about the subject of service. I'd read enough to know that, most of the spiritual teachings talk about the importance of service in spiritual life. And I was thinking I would join a program that the university had working in a mental hospital in the city of Pomona, which was close by. And at the very moment I was deciding I would do that, I reached up for a light switch, turned the light switch, and just instantaneously, everything changed in my consciousness. It was as though time stopped. It was as though everything was brighter and more vivid. The colors were brighter. Everything changed in an instant. It was a change from head to heart, from outside to inside. And I was amazed that consciousness could change in just an instant, just like that. I'd read enough to recognize that what I'd experienced was very similar to what I'd read about in books about Zen Buddhism, where certain things might touch off an aspirant and they have a sudden illumination experience. So I looked about me in this dormitory room, and it was as though I was seeing everything for the first time. I wandered out into the hallway and looked around in the hallway. If anyone saw me, they probably thought I was a crazy person. But unfortunately, it only lasted a few minutes. It probably didn't last more than about 3 minutes. But in that moment, I knew exactly what I was looking for. I knew the reality of what was said in those books about Zen Buddhism, and in fact in Vedanta and other places, was in fact the case, that there's some mechanism, some faculty within the individual, some Atmic consciousness that indeed partakes of a type of consciousness that we can hardly conceive of without experiencing it. Atmic consciousness is unqualified consciousness. It's not qualified or affected by ego or desire, by body, by mind, by personality, by worries and fears, hopes and desires. There's nothing you can say about it, almost, except perhaps the way it's described in Vedanta. It's called Sat Chit Ananda, truth, consciousness, bliss. Truth, consciousness, bliss. But there's no qualification that you can describe it. There's no color or size, or you can't glue anything to it or staple to it or stick to it. It's entirely unqualified consciousness. And so, again, the difficulty level is set very high. It's difficult to conceive of exactly what that is without experiencing it. But there are ways that we can get to it. And I'm going to describe a little bit of that to you. So when this happened, when I was in college, my freshman year, I immediately switched my major from psychology. I thought maybe psychology would have some answers, to religion. And I started studying Hinduism and Buddhism, and eventually did my thesis on the Zen teachings of Wang Po. But I just had a very difficult time trying to get this experience back again. I would meditate and I would read a lot of books, and somehow something just wasn't quite getting through to me. So it went on for that ways for a while. And when you reach a deadline, a dead end, I think you become eligible for grace. In this case, the grace happened in 1978. My mother at that time had moved to Southern California. She was living in Ojai, but she was out visiting her friends in Paradise Valley, Arizona, Bob and Barbara Bazzani. And so that's not far from Tucson, where I live, a couple hours drive. So my wife Rose and I drove up there and visited with her, and we had a nice visit. It was a little bit uneventful, but as I was leaving, she gave me a couple of books: Sai Baba Avatar by Murphet and Sandweiss's Holy Man and the Psychiatrist. I took these books and I was kind of interested. I loved the saints, Ramana Maharshi and Ramakrishna, and I'd read an old Shirdi Sai Baba book at some time previously, but I didn't know quite what to make of it. Well, to make a longer story shorter, I started reading this book, especially Sai Baba Avatar by Murphet, and I became just absolutely enthralled. It enthralled me unlike anything else had before. We took a trip up to the White Mountains of Arizona, and the entire night, all I could think going through my mind was Om Sai Baba, Om Sai Baba. In the morning, I woke up in this room and noted it had orange curtains and orange carpet and an orange bedspread. It was the morning of November 23rd, 1978, Swami's birthday. And from that time on, I became more and more enthralled with what is this energy? How does it affect me like this? I pulled out a picture from one of the books. In fact, Sai Baba Avatar, and I put it in a small plastic frame in my study room. And after about a week or so, I noticed that there were small speckles on the outside of this frame. Upon closer examination, they were not dust or anything else. It was this holy ash, apparently, that Sathya Sai Baba is said to materialize. And so I told my wife about that, and she said, well, perhaps if he sends us a personal invitation, we should go to India to visit him. We'd never been to see him before. How would he know who we are and send us a personal invitation? Well, as things progressed, I decided that I should put this picture in a nicer frame. And so I got a nice golden frame for this picture. And I don't know if you can see it there. And I cut out the green mat board on this picture. And I carried this picture throughout the house and brushed it off maybe a dozen times. And I put the picture right down beside me to cut out the piece of mat board. I cut out the mat board. I looked right back at the picture, and there was a loose pile of this holy ash rolled off into my hand. So it's hard to say exactly what to make of that, when from one instant to another, there's holy ash on this picture in front of you, and then, it wasn't there, and then it was there. How do you explain something like that? So my wife had said, well, if he sends us a personal invitation, maybe we should go visit him in India. Well, as it turned out, my mother, after visiting the Bazzanis, was of course still interested. And having lived in India for a couple of years, she decided that she would take a group of people to India to visit Sathya Sai Baba. No mind that she hadn't been there herself before. And so she sent us a nice travel flyer. It came in the mail not long after. And at the top of the flyer, it said, "This is your personal invitation to go visit Sathya Sai Baba in India." Well, that's unusual. This is your personal invitation, as she requested, to go visit Sathya Sai Baba in India. But the problem for us back then was we were young, we were 25, and really didn't have the time, didn't have the money. But As it turns out, Swami sent a real estate deal my way, and soon I got the broker handed me my real estate commission check. And when he handed me the check, he said, "John, you're fired." Well, I had the time and I had the money and I had the personal invitation. So we went for our first trip in January of 1979. When I returned, he did offer the job back. So, but anyway, so I became more and more enthralled with Sathya Sai Baba, and obviously this kind of thing would catch your attention. So I became involved in the center and became an officer. People would come to the center and say, "Yes, we love the stories about Sai Baba, but what does he teach?" And so we really didn't have any book. You could give them books of quotations. So I started writing Pathways to God, Volume 1. So I became involved in the organization, in the center, singing, all of these different things. Became a regional representative. Ultimately, in later years, I became president of the Sathya Sai Central Council USA from 2001 to 2011. I'll say a little bit more about that later. So, so I became very involved, and I think it was that involvement, that service. I didn't think of it as service, but in some ways it was service that made the difference. Because what I was missing when I had the experience in college was not trying to get the experience back, but what I was doing when I had the experience. When I reached up for that light switch, I had decided to engage in service activities and did, in fact, engage in the college's program at the mental hospital in Pomona. And so I became involved in service, and perhaps that is what turned the tide for me. On a trip to India in 1987, my wife Rose and I were there in January. We were staying at the Taj Hotel, room 821, and on January 30th, I'd gone down in the evening after being out at Whitefield for darshan, and I picked up a book in the bookstore. It was a Ramana Maharshi sayings book, as it turned out. Brought it back up to the room, and I was just kind of leafing through it about 7:10 p.m. And all of a sudden, just in an instant, that experience was back again. In an instant, it was as though time had stopped, as though everything were brighter, more energetic, as though my consciousness switched from head to heart, as though everything changed at one time. So naturally, I was a little hesitant because the previous time it had only lasted a few minutes. So I tried to keep my consciousness on the heart and not let the mind go crazy. And so we went from minute to minute, and then hour to hour, and day to day. And ultimately, it never left. So something to be said for the power of both study, service, and devotion. The service may have tipped the key, but study is very important. Many people actually have that experience. I used to talk a lot at various conferences around the country, and almost everywhere I went, some people had the experience for a shorter or longer period of time. One high official in the Sai organization told me that he was in India at Puttaparthi visiting Swami, and Swami gave him that experience for 3 days. At the end of 3 days, I went away and he said, "Swami, how do I get that experience back?" Swami said, "More work, work, work." Another individual I met had it for 6 months and it went away. The problem is you need to understand something about the nature of that experience. And the nature of that experience, I like to describe through kind of an analogy. If you picture yourself standing on between railroad tracks, on a railroad track, between the rails, there's two rails in front of you. One of them on the left is the rail of body, mind, personality, your whole embodied personality, everything that you experience in the world. The rail on the right is Atma. It's unqualified, pure consciousness, divine consciousness, Sat, Chit, Ananda. And the two of them look like they come together. If you look out towards the horizon, it looks as though at some point the rails come together, but in fact, they never do. If they did, the train would tip over at some point. The utility of the whole situation is that they always remain an equal distance apart. And so one of the things that people have difficulty dealing with, if they don't really understand the nature of Atma consciousness, is that the perfection of Atma consciousness, perfect in the sense that it's unqualified, that there's no blame you can lay upon it. It exists coincidentally at the same time as the rail of body, mind, personality, which is inherently imperfect. So you need to get used to the idea that perfection and imperfection exist within you at the same time in the same person. The problem people have is they feel the divine consciousness, the Atmic consciousness, and they say, I feel so good. And then their husband or wife asks them to go out and get some milk at the store, and they get in their car and they say, oh, look, everything's so divine. Then someone cuts in front of them in the car and they say, that person, that's such and such person cut in front of me, and where did they come from? And before you know it, you're blaming yourself. I'm not perfect. I'm not worthy. The mind takes over and you lose the consciousness because you don't realize that the perfection and the imperfection exist coincidentally. There really are no perfect beings in the world. We'll leave aside the subject of Swami for the moment, but if you think of whoever you want to think of, everyone receives criticism. Mahatma Gandhi was criticized for sleeping in the same bed as his young nieces. Martin Luther King was criticized for plagiarizing part of his doctoral thesis at Boston University. Mother Teresa, there is a saint. Surely she has no blame. But after she passed away, in her journal, she confessed to terrible doubts about her faith. There is no perfection in body, mind, personality. The perfection only exists in Atma, and they exist coincidentally. So when Swami says the third part of the quotation, I will transport you across the sea of samsara, it's true, but you need to be ready. You need to understand something about it. You need to do the service, and you also need devotion, because nothing like that happens but by the grace of God. So let's go to the second part of the quotation. Swami said, I will bear the burden of your welfare. He said, when you surrender fully to me, I will bear the burden of your welfare, and I will transport you across the sea of samsara, the sea of worldly concern. Well, that's a great promise that Swami will bear the burden of our welfare. And all we have to do is give up this video image of ourselves playing the game, body, mind, personality, this temporary, inherently imperfect figment. And we're not even losing anything. It's not like you're going to lose your body or your mind or your hopes and desires. You're only going to improve them. You're going to dedicate them to God. God will give you better hopes and desires. God will make everything better for you. But sometimes better isn't easy. bearing the burden of our welfare is a two-edged sword. Sometimes the burden of our welfare involves helping us get through our karma. If you want to come to the goal of Atmic consciousness, then you need to get through the karmic burdens that stand in your way. And that's not often easy. So that's a possibility. But on the other hand, Swami also is very sincere in saying that you will bear the burdens of your welfare. Even if you go through the difficulties of your karma, Swami says that grace is like an anesthetic. You might go through it, but you won't feel it. It won't be nearly as painful. Without attachment, then the pain is much less severe. Most people torment themselves with their own attachments. So Swami says he will bear the burden of your welfare, and he will do that if you dedicate your actions, your being to him, to really to your own higher self. I've got an example of that, a story for you. I think we've got enough time here. Let me just check the time and make sure I'm not going totally over.
Yeah, we have enough time. Please go ahead.
Okay. I want to tell you about the pilgrimage to India in 2011 that the USA organization made. I was the president of the Central Council at the time, and so David Grease, our regional coordinator, asked me if I would be in charge of the pilgrimage to India for the USA. Well, it only seemed logical that I should do it because I was the head of the Central Council. And but what do I know about running a pilgrimage for hundreds of people to India? I know nothing. So naturally, I gave the task to Swami. Swami said, "You will bear the burden of our welfare." Well, certainly you want to give that kind of burden to Swami. So almost immediately after I had done that, everything started coming together in kind of a miraculous way. I got suggestions from all the regional presidents. We held conference calls. We ended up creating all kinds of different committees. We had a committee for service at the ashram. We had a committee for preparing people for the pilgrimage, doing study and devotion. We had a committee in charge of accommodations. We had a medical committee so that we could take care of medical emergencies while there. We had a service committee that would engage people if they wanted to work in the canteens or whatever. We had a committee for darshan so that seating would be equitable and we could rotate people. We even had people working on matching saris. The ladies in the pilgrimage each received 3 saris, which they ordered. So we had to arrange that through PayPal and get those to them. And we had to give them a calendar so they would know which days to wear which sari. So in addition to that, there were at least 3 cultural presentations. The one from the Northwest region involved a children's play on an Indian theme. It involved 200 kids. There were backdrops. There were all kinds of things required. There was a choir. We had all kinds of things going on. So it was miraculous that all of this came together. In fact, I was going to be in the second group. We had 2 groups. The first group went in the end of June, and the second group in the beginning of July. And unbeknownst to me, since I wasn't going to be there when the first group arrived, I put in charge one of my council members, my friend Harish, and I didn't know it at the time, but it was the perfect choice because Harish's father had been the state president of the Tamil Nadu region. Harish knew the president, or the head of the ashram, since he was about 9 years old. So I made what seemed like a random choice that set everything in motion perfectly by the grace of Swami. And the whole thing just came off beautifully. Swami had not been out for morning darshan for 6 months before the USA group arrived. And when we arrived, he started coming out every morning. He talked to all of the council members at least once or twice in our group. And the whole thing was blissful. Swami posed with pictures for the children. It was miraculous. And the thing that was the most miraculous of all, and shows you that it was all Swami's grace, is that we had almost 1,700 people. I think it was about 1,682 there in India for almost a month. And I never heard a single complaint about the way we had arranged the whole pilgrimage. I have to imagine there must have been some. You would think that if there were some serious complaints, it would have gotten up to me, but there was never a single complaint about the entire pilgrimage, which is miraculous, and which is a testament to giving your burdens over to Swami. He will bear the burden of your welfare. But one thing you have to keep in mind is that you also have your duties. You also have to play your part. And I'll end with this story about the service conference in 2000. I think it was 2002 or so in July. I was invited to go speak at the service conference there in the beginning of July. Dr. Goldstein asked me to. The theme of the conference was Sai, S-A-I, which is for service, adoration, illumination. And he asked me to speak on the illumination part of the subject. And so I went, and Swami gave some beautiful discourses. On the second day, I remember sitting in darshan listening to Swami's discourse. And at the end of it, I was a little bit puzzled because the previous day, Swami had said, "Tomorrow I will answer all your questions. Tomorrow I will tell you all what to do." That's what he said. He said, "Tomorrow I will tell you all exactly what to do." And yet he hadn't said anything in this discourse. There were no organizational pronouncements. There was no notice up on the bulletin board of what we were supposed to do. And so I started wandering back towards Roundhouse number 1, where I had to have a room. It's R1C1, R1C1. It's easy to remember. And I got as far as the Ganesha garden, right in front of the Ganesha statue. And all of a sudden, I knew exactly what Swami wanted me to do. He wanted me to do the 3rd Pathways to God volume, the one on the subject of self-illumination, of realization. And so I wandered the rest of the way back to my room, and my wife was up there. And I said, "I know exactly what Swami wants me to do." And she said, "Yeah, I do too. I know exactly what Swami wants me to do." She was a nurse, and she knew she was supposed to do some work in the hospital. So the next day I went out and started talking to people in the crowd, and I said, "Yesterday, what was it that Swami told you to do?" And I think everyone I talked to knew what they were supposed to do. So Swami had told everyone what to do, not in organizational pronouncements, not on bulletin messages, but to the heart. And when Swami tells you what to do to the heart, it's still up to you whether you accept that or not, whether you surrender to that divine will and do the divine will or not. I told B. Flagg about that, and she said she used to go to educational conferences, and Swami did the same thing. He would say, "Before you leave, I will answer all your questions." And although he didn't take question and answers, maybe a few, everyone had all their questions answered before they left. So in that case, yes, Swami will bear the burden of your welfare, But there's certain things you need to be attuned to that Swami might want you to do. And it's up to you to surrender to the call of the higher self. Um, so, so that's the story of this quotation. It's not about surrendering to someone else or to something else. It's to your own higher divine nature. And that divine nature resides within you. And you can know that divine nature. Um, it's quite possible. It's high level of difficulty as the video games are, which you might play, but you get there through study and through service and through devotion and by listening to the prompts of the divine and playing your part. As the quotation at the beginning of the presentation said, you play your part to make the world a better place. So with that, I think I'm pretty well through my time, and I'll turn it back to Greg. Sairam. Thank you for being with us.